In this video, I want to talk about what might be called the standard way to think about disability. And that is that disability says something about the person who is labeled with the disability. And really, that's all it says. So when we think about someone who has ADHD, someone who's been diagnosed with autism, we think about the idea that the disability diagnosis signifies something about that person. And I'm not going to deny that. Certainly if someone is diagnosed with ADHD or depression or autism, it does say something about the behaviors, the development, the nature of that person. But I'm also going to say that there's a really key cultural and environmental aspect of diversity. And namely, that is, if you have a label of a disability, it says something not only about you, but about what your culture and environment deems to be kind of acceptable, normal, natural, good behavior. So to see that, let's look at a disability that was in the 1850s. It was floated around by a guy named Samuel Cartwright. And while it wasn't in any DSM books, diagnostic statistical manuals, that's because the diagnostic and statistical manual for psychological disorders didn't exist yet. This was called Drapetomania. And Cartwright argued that Drapetomania was prevalent among a particular group of people who didn't really deal with stress and adversity very well. And it would lead them to do things like really fight against stress in a way that might be violent or dangerous. And they would resort to covert means to try to escape the stress and the adversity that they were under. And that this was abnormal. Okay, sounds good so far. But the group that he was talking about was African Americans who were enslaved in the 1850s. So here's what he wrote in his proposal for this disability. The causes in most cases that induces the Negro to run away from service is as much a disease of the mind as any other species of mental alienation. Now, when we look at that today, we kind of blanch a little bit. And the reason we blanch is because it's kind of understood that the idea that slaves would want to run away from their captivity isn't really so much a disorder. It's just an expected, and we would say pretty natural response. I mean, today we wouldn't think about diagnosing someone who tries to escape from a kidnapper as having a disability. We would just think that they're doing the natural thing. Well, in a lot of cases, that's the way we think of slavery. These were people who were just trying to run away from really averse captivity. Now, the problem is that in Cartwright's day, he saw slavery as a natural order of things. He thought that slavery was natural, slaves needed to accept their fate, and that's what most slaves in fact did. So he thought that the ones who didn't, there must be something wrong with them, and it rose to the level of a disability. So hopefully in this we can see that there's really two components to any disability. There's what you might call a biological or individual component of a disability. And then there's the cultural, environmental, or we might call social element of a disability. So, and it really, to say that a person has a disability really involves both parts of these. First, you have to say that there's certain behaviors that the individual brings to the table that we think are maybe outside of the norm. So in this case, obviously, it was slaves who wanted to run away from their masters or fight their masters for their freedom, etc., things like that. That's what the individual brought to the table. But there's a really key cultural and environmental piece to these disabilities, and it's, does the behavior that you're exhibiting seem to be normal, natural, expected? Is it problematic? Is it unproblematic? And in order to answer questions about whether a behavior is just a behavior or whether it's a disability and it's problematic behavior is really something that is culturally relative. Today, we would never consider drapetomania to be a disability because it's really, we see it as just an expected behavior. But in the 1850s, when slavery was still a normal and natural thing to a lot of people, people thought that those who rebelled against their servitude were exhibiting not just behavior, but problematic behavior. So in this case, you see the biological component is the act of trying to break free from slavery. The cultural or environmental part is this behavior unacceptable? Another way to think about this is that we expect certain kinds of behaviors as normal. And a lot of that is culturally relative, and sometimes that's relative to time and place. So if you think about any kind of particular behavior, let's think about, the ability to learn on grade level. We have kind of a bell curve, and most people cluster towards the middle. They exhibit what we would call normal behavior. But then there are folks who are really kind of on the outsides, and they exhibit they're outliers. They exhibit abnormal behavior. So you might think of people who get severely behind grade level. You might think of people who absorb material fast enough that they rise significantly above grade level. And those are the behaviors we really need to try to, I guess, explain in the sense of, is it a disability? What is it? Because we grow so used to the norm that whenever we see something outside of the norm, we kind of react strongly. And here's, in order to think about this, I want to introduce a certain cognitive bias called the status quo bias. And the status quo bias goes like this. X is normal behavior, and we see that X is normal behavior. Grade level performance is normal behavior. Therefore, X is natural. Since we see people learning on grade level more than people who are outliers, we assume that learning on grade level is just the natural way things go. So whenever we see outliers, either people who are really far behind grade level or above grade level, we start to think, okay, maybe there's a disability here. Therefore, it's kind of a deficit or something like that. It's too far outside the norm, and it now needs to be explained. So in the Drapetomania example, here's how that would go. Accepting servitude would be the norm. Therefore, accepting servitude is natural for slaves to do. So therefore, when you confront someone who doesn't accept servitude as a slave, now you have behavior that's so far outside the norm that it's a disability that now needs to be explained. Let's look at another example so that we can drive home the point a little bit. Up until 1987, the DSM's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders called Ego-Dystonic Homosexuality a disorder. And here are the two criteria. Number one, the individual complains that heterosexual arousal is absent or weak. They can't get up any sort of heterosexual urge. But B is really key. There's a sustained pattern of homosexual arousal that the individual states has been unwanted and is a source of disorder. So here we can see kind of like with Drapetomania, today we wouldn't really think of ego-dystonic homosexuality as a disorder. If you don't have heterosexual urges, we wouldn't really think to qualify that you would qualify as being disordered or diseased. But before 1987, because heterosexuality was just the expected outcome, what would happen is if someone didn't experience heterosexual urges, they would usually really want to be heterosexual. They would really be sad about the fact that they couldn't experience heterosexual relations and heterosexual love. So that would rise to the level of a disorder. So now we can see that there's two components to this. So the biology part is attraction to the same sex. Are you attracted to the same sex, or are you attracted to a different sex? But then there's a cultural environmental part. If you're living in a culture where heterosexuality is the norm, you might be considered to have a disability if you deviate from the heterosexual norm. Now, if you live in a bit more of a permissive society like ours, we're a bit more tolerant of differences in sexuality, ego-dystonic homosexuality or heterosexuality doesn't really become a difficulty, because if you're gay or lesbian or bisexual, you're probably not going to have that strong of an urge to say, oh no, I'm not heterosexual, therefore I must have a disorder, there's something wrong with me. But again, it's culturally relative. Here's a final disability to kind of illustrate exactly what we're talking about. This one's called specific learning disorder, and this is kind of a catch-all term for academically based learning disorders. And this diagnosis exists in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th edition, which just came out in 2014. So let's look at this first highlight here. A key feature is that the individual's performance in a particular area is well below average for age. Oftentimes, individuals with learning disorder will achieve at least 1.5 standard deviations below the norm for their age on standardized tests, etc., etc. So what we're saying is that an individual has to be below grade level to a certain degree in order to have a specific learning disability. So there's a biological component and there's a cultural component. And it might be better to say an individual component than a biological component. So the biological or individual component is that a person doesn't perform well on a specific kind of task as measured by tests and things like that. That's what the individual brings to the table. The diagnosis is supposed to signify only that. But the diagnosis actually signifies some really interesting cultural and environmental things as well. So first of all, you notice that in order to measure whether you're behind for this disability, we're using standardized tests to figure that out. Well, standardized tests are only in certain areas: math, reading, science, social studies, things like that. So really, this disability is going to be diagnosed only for things that the school environment as it exists right now regards as important. Let's say that you have a disability in reading, you're falling far behind your peers in reading, or you're not really able to do the same math problems your peers were able to do. That would be cause for saying you have a specific learning disability. But let's say that you fell behind in the visual arts, in your art class. You're just not very good at representing three-dimensional objects on paper. Or let's say you fall behind in physical education. You're just not very physically coordinated, especially compared to your peers. It could be that you're 1.5 standard deviations below your peers there, but the fact is most people aren't going to consider that a learning disability because we've assigned particular values to particular subjects. And reading, math, social studies, science are the really concerning ones. So if you fall behind in fine arts, you're probably not likely to be diagnosed with a disability, just because culturally those tasks are not considered as important academically as reading and writing are. Another social element to this is, what does well below average mean? There's no fine line, there's no obvious dividing point between when someone is just kind of struggling with a subject and when someone has fallen far below in a subject. Now, the definition tries to give an objective measure, 1.5 standard deviations below the norm. But even what the norm is in your particular area is going to be relative. So if you live in a high-income area where academics are super valued, the norm is going to be very high. People are going to be on grade level, maybe above grade level. It's going to be more rare for people to fall behind. If you live in a lower income area, the norm might be lower. There may not be as many resources there for education, so it may be that most of the students are behind grade level, which pushes the norm down for your grade level, which means you would have to be very far behind even that norm to qualify as a specific learning disability. So quite literally, someone in a high-performing area is going to have to be less behind than someone in a lower-performing area to qualify for the same diagnosis. And it also could be that different psychologists are going to differ in their comfort levels. Some psychologists think that far behind only means 1 standard deviation below the norm. Another psychologist might think it's 1.5, and another one might even be reluctant to say that that's a learning disability. But that's culturally and environmentally relative. Whether you're diagnosed with a disability really is partially going to depend on where you are, your environment and your culture. And last, there's an assumption undergirding all of this talk of specific learning disabilities that grade level is the normal way to be. So before there was a public school system where everyone was kind of followed their grade level and first graders were together, second graders were together, third graders were together, quite literally there was no such thing as a learning disability, because by the standards of this disability, it's measured by whether you are below your same age peers. So the assumption is that same age peers should all be on the same level. If you take out that assumption, and whether it's a good assumption, we don't know, we just accept it as normal. If you take out that assumption, quite literally, you couldn't have the specific learning disability by the DSM-5's criteria. So hopefully I've given you something to think about in terms of the individual component of disabilities and the social and cultural component. To just briefly recap, the individual component to a disability is what the person who is diagnosed brings to the table to warrant that disability. But there's the cultural and environmental aspect as well. Whether that behavior is not only considered deviation from the norm, but whether that behavior is considered problematic. We don't see ego-dystonic homosexuality today because we don't regard homosexuality as a problematic behavior in the same way we did in 1950. So there's an individual component and a cultural component to diagnosis of learning and other disabilities.